Most people believe they want confidence because they imagine it as strength. But what they are really trying to escape is something quieter and more corrosive. The feeling of being read too easily, sized up too quickly, and adjusted by others before they have even spoken. That discomfort did not appear randomly. It formed because being predictable has already cost you something: respect, leverage, or the freedom to exist without explanation. What feels like insecurity is often the aftereffect of exposure. Not dramatic exposure, not humiliation, but the slow realization that people respond to you before you decide how much of yourself to reveal. Confidence becomes attractive at that point not because it promises dominance, but because it promises relief. Relief from being transparent in a world that quietly exploits what it understands too well. When others can anticipate your reactions, your values, your emotional thresholds, they no longer need to engage you fully. They adjust around you. They categorize you. And without realizing it, you begin living inside a version of yourself that is easier for others to navigate than it is for you to inhabit. This is where most misunderstandings about confidence begin. People assume confidence is something you project outward: posture, voice, certainty. But what is actually being negotiated is access. How quickly you reveal what you think. How readily you explain what you feel. How available you remain even when presence begins to feel costly. Over time, this availability starts to feel virtuous. You tell yourself you are open, honest, emotionally intelligent, and none of those explanations are false. But they are incomplete, because openness without discretion does not create connection. It creates exposure. The more consistently you make yourself available, the more the world learns how to move around you without resistance. Your preferences become predictable. Your reactions become expected. Your presence becomes manageable. And once that happens, something subtle shifts. People no longer need to listen as carefully. They already know where you stand. They no longer need to negotiate with you. You've already revealed the terms. What feels like being understood is often just being mapped. Carl Jung warned that what remains unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Most people never question how much of their inner life is being made public by default. They assume that being known is the same as being respected. But respect does not come from being fully visible. It comes from being partially unreadable, from having depth that is not immediately accessible, from withholding certain internal processes from constant exposure, not to manipulate others, but to preserve coherence within yourself. The problem is that once you begin equating openness with safety, withdrawal starts to feel like danger. Silence feels suspicious. Restraint feels dishonest. You stay reachable not because you want to, but because absence feels heavier than presence. And the longer this pattern continues, the harder it becomes to tell whether you are choosing availability, or whether it has quietly become the condition under which you are allowed to exist without friction. Most people never stop to ask what confidence actually protects. Not power, not dominance, but privacy, psychological distance, the ability to remain internally intact without constant negotiation. And until that distinction is seen clearly, confidence will continue to feel like something missing, something you need to become, rather than something that emerges when certain forms of access quietly disappear. And this is where the real question begins. Because if confidence is not about adding something to yourself, but about removing something that has been draining you, then the problem is no longer personal. It is structural. And what that structure looks like, and why it is so difficult to step outside of it, is what we need to look at next. What begins as a personal pattern does not remain personal for long. Once a certain level of openness, responsiveness, or emotional availability becomes consistent, the environment adjusts to it without asking your permission. People begin to assume access rather than request it. Conversations stretch past their natural end. Expectations form quietly and solidify without discussion. The world does not pause to consider whether this availability costs you something. It simply learns that you can be reached, that you will respond, that you will accommodate. And because nothing catastrophic happens immediately, the system reinforces itself. Relief arrives early, long before reflection. Each time you remain available, the discomfort of absence is avoided, and the body learns a simple lesson. Staying reachable keeps tension away. Over time, this relief stops feeling like a response and starts feeling like evidence that this is who you are meant to be. From the outside, this looks like reliability, emotional intelligence, strength. From the inside, it feels like a low-grade vigilance that never fully shuts off. You are no longer reacting to what is happening. You are anticipating what might be required of you, adjusting before the request is spoken, preparing explanations before boundaries are crossed. This is how availability stops being a choice and becomes a condition. Carl Jung warned that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It organizes behavior from beneath awareness. And most people never question how much of their inner life is being made public by default. Not through confession, but through predictability. When your responses become consistent, your presence becomes legible. When you are legible, you are easy to position. None of this requires malicious intent from others. It doesn't require exploitation or cruelty. Systems do not need villains to function. They only need patterns. And once a pattern is established, the system begins to reward it subtly. Predictability is met with smoother interactions. Readability is met with reassurance. Openness is met with inclusion. The cost is not obvious because it does not announce itself as loss. It arrives as a narrowing of possibility. Certain reactions no longer feel available to you. Certain absences feel heavier than they should. Silence begins to feel like tension rather than neutrality. You start confusing peace with predictability, mistaking the absence of friction for alignment. And because this structure feels stable, even mature, it rarely gets questioned. After all, you are functioning. You are liked. You are included. But beneath that stability, something important has shifted. The center of gravity has moved outward. Decisions are no longer guided by internal signal alone, but by anticipated response. Presence is calibrated against expectation. And the more smoothly this system runs, the harder it becomes to notice that it is running at all. The most difficult part is not that this structure restricts you, but that it never calls itself a cage. It calls itself being considerate, being adaptable, being confident. And if confidence were simply about projecting strength, this would be enough. But if confidence has anything to do with internal authority, if it has anything to do with not being reorganized before you've chosen, then something here is already off. Because a structure built on anticipation rather than contact is efficient, but it is also fragile. And hidden inside it is a weakness most people never see, not because it is complex, but because the system works too well to draw attention to itself. That weakness is what comes next. If this is making sense, subscribing just means you won't miss what comes next. Every structure that relies on anticipation rather than contact carries a flaw that is easy to miss precisely because the system appears to function so smoothly. Anticipation feels intelligent. It feels protective. It feels like foresight. But anticipation is built entirely on projection, and projection has no corrective mechanism of its own. Reality, when allowed to arrive, corrects assumptions. Anticipation does not. It grows unchecked, feeding on imagined outcomes rather than lived experience. The discomfort you have been regulating all along was never produced by what actually happened. It was produced by what you expected might happen if you withdrew, delayed, remained silent, or became less accessible. That expectation intensifies in isolation. It does not test itself. It does not verify. It only escalates. This is why the structure works so hard to prevent one specific thing from occurring: initiation. Because initiation introduces evidence. And evidence is dangerous, not to you, but to the system that depends on prediction. The moment something happens closer to when it actually occurs, rather than when it is imagined, the entire feedback loop is disrupted. The system does not collapse instantly, but its certainty weakens. That weakening is subtle. It does not feel like relief or success. It feels like instability, and instability is interpreted as threat. This is why the pressure increases precisely at the moment when action is closest. Not because action is inherently risky, but because it introduces information the system cannot control in advance. The anticipation has been doing all the work. It has been generating discomfort early, amplifying it, and resolving it prematurely through availability. Reality has rarely been given the chance to speak. And when it is, the experience is rarely as catastrophic as the prediction suggested, but the system does not register that correction cleanly, because correction requires repetition. One instance is dismissed as an exception, two are treated as coincidence, three begin to look like a pattern, and patterns threaten identity. This is where many people believe awareness will save them. They think that seeing the mechanism will interrupt it, but understanding is not interruption. Awareness often intensifies the process instead of weakening it. Once the pattern is named, monitoring begins. You start watching yourself anticipate. You begin evaluating your responses before they occur. You attempt to manage the timing more precisely. And in doing so, you unintentionally strengthen the very structure you are trying to observe. The system does not rely on ignorance. It relies on timing. As long as anticipation arrives early enough, it prevents contact from occurring naturally. The body never receives updated information. The nervous system never recalibrates. The prediction remains unchallenged. This is why so many attempts to change feel exhausting rather than liberating. You are not fighting resistance. You are fighting a structure designed to preempt experience itself. And the more you try to use insight to override it, the more tightly it organizes around vigilance. What looks like caution is actually preservation. What feels like self-control is often fear being administered efficiently. The weakness is real, but it is not accessible through effort. It exists at the precise boundary where anticipation ends and contact would begin. And that boundary is not a strategy. It is a threshold. What happens when that threshold is approached, but not crossed, is where the system reveals how much it depends on keeping you just ahead of life, never quite inside it. Once this weakness is exposed, the structure does not weaken in the way people expect. It does not fall apart. It does not retreat. It recalibrates. What once operated quietly now becomes more attentive. The moment anticipation senses that its predictions are being questioned, it tightens its timing. Pressure no longer gathers around the initial moment of withdrawal. It relocates to repetition. One instance of reduced availability can be tolerated. It is dismissed as context, mood, coincidence. But when absence begins to resemble a pattern, the structure reacts. Not with panic, but with refinement. The discomfort intensifies not because something bad is happening, but because identity is being destabilized. What once felt like reflex now feels like responsibility. You are no longer simply responding. You are aware that you are responding, and that awareness does not free you. It watches you. Silence becomes deliberate. Delay becomes meaningful. Every deviation is evaluated for consequence before it is allowed to occur. This is how awareness turns inward and becomes surveillance. The structure survives not by preventing change, but by forcing change to be managed consciously. Control replaces instinct. Monitoring replaces contact. The moment you begin trying to do this correctly, the system has already adapted. It has shifted from regulating behavior to regulating intention. You start asking whether you are being unavailable for the right reasons, whether the timing is appropriate, whether you are being fair, whether this version of restraint is defensible. And in that questioning, the original relief pattern quietly reasserts itself. Because relief is still the fastest way to end uncertainty. Availability returns not as habit, but as justification. Not because you forgot what you saw, but because the cost of sustaining vigilance feels heavier than the cost of returning to what is familiar. This is where many people mistake refinement for progress. They believe they are learning how to be unavailable better, more ethically, more consciously. But what is actually happening is that the structure has learned how to survive insight. It no longer needs ignorance. It needs only participation. And participation is easy to secure when responsibility is framed as maturity. The more you try to manage yourself, the more energy the system draws from your attention. What once operated automatically now consumes effort. What once felt like protection now feels like work. This is not because you are failing. It is because the structure does not resist difficulty. It resists unpredictability. Repetition introduces unpredictability. Patterns introduce narrative instability. And narrative instability threatens the identity you have been living inside. That is why this phase often feels more exhausting than the one before it. You are not stuck because nothing is changing. You are stuck because too much is being managed. By the end of this process, the question is no longer how to withdraw correctly or how to remain unavailable without consequence. The question that begins to surface, quietly, without resolution, is whether the very need to decide, monitor, and control has become the source of the tension itself. And if that is true, then whatever comes next cannot be another strategy. It cannot be another form of effort, because effort is already part of what the structure knows how to use. At some point, without ceremony, the question that has been driving everything begins to lose its grip. Not because it has been answered, but because it no longer organizes experience in the same way. The need to manage availability, to decide when to withdraw and when to remain present, starts to feel strangely irrelevant. Not empowering, not liberating, just unnecessary. What changes first is not behavior but friction. The old relief that once arrived from being immediately reachable begins to dull. It still works, but it costs more. It requires explanation, justification, monitoring. Availability stops feeling like ease and starts feeling heavy. And absence, which once triggered urgency and anxiety, no longer carries the same charge. Not because you have become indifferent, but because anticipation is no longer allowed to run unchecked. Things begin to happen closer to when they actually occur, rather than being lived in advance. The nervous system stops rehearsing outcomes that never arrive. There is no dramatic shift in personality, no moment of confidence, no sense of victory. In fact, the absence of constant internal management can feel empty at first, disorienting. Many people mistake this quiet for loss because they are accustomed to effort as evidence of engagement. But what has actually changed is that the structure no longer needs to be negotiated with. Not because it has been defeated, but because it has been deprived of the timing advantage it depended on. When experience is allowed to correct itself, prediction loses its authority. Not instantly, not cleanly, but steadily. The world does not become harmless. People do not become safe. You are not protected from being hurt. What dissolves instead is the amplification, the preemptive tension, the self-organizing vigilance that once made every interaction heavier than it needed to be. Authority is not reclaimed. It is rendered irrelevant as a question. There is no longer a need to decide who you are in relation to access, because access is no longer the primary organizing principle of your inner life. Confidence does not arrive as strength or dominance. It arrives as absence, the absence of compulsive explanation, the absence of rehearsed positioning, the absence of constant self-reference. And because it is unremarkable, it is often missed, until you notice that certain pressures no longer form, certain urgencies no longer appear, certain invitations no longer rearrange you before you've even responded. Nothing and nobody will ever hurt you again was never the truth. The truth is quieter and less impressive. The mechanisms that once made hurt unavoidable lose their precision. They stop operating ahead of time. And by the time something actually happens, it happens where it belongs, in the present, not inside a system that has already decided what it means.